Michael, come and sit. Oh, there. Good. Well, let's do it. Okay, welcome here to Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Stefan Dercon here. I'm a professor here of economic policy. Always interested in Africa. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, and it's great tonight to be able to have an event that hopefully will have some great discussion on issues to do with public policy and different perspectives on how to think about how to do it. And our main guest here is Dr Shamsuddeen Usman, an economist who is currently moved back to the private sector in a consulting firm called Usman and Associate, where he's the CEO. He did study in Nigeria, also at the LSE, where he got his PhD. But he's best known as a policymaker, as working various times as Minister of National Planning, Minister of Finance, a Deputy Governor of the Central Bank in Nigeria, then moving back into the private sector, in working in several banks. And look, we're going to give him the floor in a moment, but I'm going to also actually briefly introduce a few other people that you will hear from tonight. We'll have Dr. Nevin, who is an entrepreneur, equity investor, private equity investor, an economist and strategic consultant. He did work in places like McKinsey. He did also in this kind of slightly unknown university, Harvard or something, a PhD. But he was a Rhodes Scholar here in Oxford. That's probably where he had his main training here. But we will hear from him a bit more in a moment. And we'll also have him as part of a panel that Dr Michael Odijie here from Oxford here is an associate professor of African history and African studies, and it's worth just briefly introducing him here. He's someone who straddles history and area studies, so he's in both of the schools here in Oxford, working on contemporary and historical themes on West Africa and also issues to do with the politics of development. I could have said far more about each of these people and apologize if I was concise. But we want to hear from them rather than from me. So I would actually want to invite Dr. Usman to actually give an introduction to his book and other issues that he wants to cover here today. Thank you very much. Thank
you. Good evening, and thank you everyone for attending. I just want to give a brief background to the book itself. My educational background has been mentioned briefly. My first degree was from Nigeria, but I had the master's and PhD from the London School of Economics. And since those days, I have been concerned about development. And my question I always ask is, why is Nigeria not progressing as much as some of the other countries that I will talk about and that I have visited and engaged with? I've had many executive positions. I started in academics, teaching full-time in one university and part-time in 3 other universities. Then I went into the banking industry, and I'm one of the probably very lucky Nigerians that has had experience of working in all these different sectors of finance: development banking, merchant banking, commercial banking, and I ended up as deputy governor in the central bank, where I was for the first 4 years in charge of monetary policy and banking regulations, and for the next 3 years, banking operations, so currency issues and so on. From there, I was appointed Minister of Finance. And after some time, about two years, there was a cabinet reshuffle, and I was moved to national planning. So that's the background, as Stefan says, I've been involved in policy making, and the question, after I left office as governor, I had been contemplating writing a book all along, but I really didn't have enough time until after I left as Minister of National Planning. But even then, some of the issues were so raw that I felt it's better to allow some time to elapse before putting down my thoughts in writing. Now, during my work, particularly as Deputy Governor in Central Bank, Minister of Finance, and Minister of National Planning, I also had the opportunity to visit, sometimes deliberately, countries that would be considered as, if you like, comparators to Nigeria. Malaysia is not on the list. There are Indonesia, India, Egypt, South Africa, where I engaged at ministerial level with ministers of finance and ministers of national planning, trying to understand, how they did it. Particularly, say, take India, how they were able to implement their Vision 2020. Malaysia arranged a program in 2008 for ministers from about 14 countries. I was one of them, including Britain. The minister from UK also attended, to try to understand how they were successful with their Vision 2020 as well, particularly the implementation aspect, and particularly the monitoring and evaluation with clear key performance indicators. So if you like, the conclusion that I came to after all this, in terms of how to focus, I looked at many development theories, including the famous book by Stefan, Gambling on Development. And I came to the conclusion that perhaps, yes, many of those different theories explain different aspects of what's happening in Nigeria and similar developing countries. But I felt that, for me, the most potent explanation is in the agency, what is described as the agency problem, where the public officials, whether political or official, are supposed to actually represent the interest of the public as the agents, and that the public are the principals. But unfortunately, in Nigeria and a few other countries, this has been turned around because of selfish personal interest of these officials. They are representing more of their own interest rather than the interest of the ordinary citizen. So that was the theme that I wanted to write the book about. But I realized that it's not enough to just write about my own experience. Let me invite other people who have had experience in policy making to come in and contribute to the book, so that it will be richer, and it's not going to be talking only about my experience, but also those of, and in that process, I invited about 11 other people to come in and contribute based on their own personal experiences as well. So the agency problem, which is really the micro foundation of institutional failure, is, and this principal agent formulation leads to a divergence between socially and privately optimal behavior. And what we found, and Andrew is here, he wrote when I contacted Andrew to contribute to the book, and I told him that I'm discussing, the whole thing is around the agent principle issue. He actually told me a very interesting story that his supervisor here in Harvard, was a leading authority, and he will explain that to you. So I asked him to, because of his familiarity with the subject, he actually wrote the first chapter, which establishes the principle. But also because Andrew had spent 15 years working in Nigeria. So not only is he very familiar with the theory, but he has had extensive private sector experience in Nigeria. Now, so I think, in fact, in terms of going into detail, I will leave that to Andrew when it comes to explain the agent principal relationship much more. I wrote 4 chapters in the book. The first one was, again, my experience as Minister of Finance. I tried to reform. You know, I was a very reform-minded, and the focus was on transparency and accountability in public financial management. I took on customs reform, reform of the public sector itself, the ministry. Reform of the management, the key management that led all the economic transformation effort that we are making, being the chairman of what is called the EMT, Economic Management Team. So the first chapter I wrote is around that. The second is around, challenges of designing and implementing medium and long-term plans. Nigeria's Vision 2020 and the first 4-year implementation plan. I led, as Minister of National Planning, really the effort to define a 2020 vision for Nigeria. President Obasanjo had actually started the program, but it had not made any progress because it was more a mouse thing. There was nothing down in writing that says this is where we are going and this is how we are going to achieve the Vision 2020. So I led the effort to document it using over 1,500 Nigerians that are from different sectors of the country, experts that we put together, as well as a 4-year implementation plan to start the implementation. I also led the effort to write a 30-year, to document a 30-year infrastructure master plan, because we have great challenges in infrastructure. As at that time, we were actually ahead of Britain, because I recall it was about 2 years later that Britain started its own long-term infrastructure master plan. The third chapter that I wrote has to do with the review and reform of Nigeria's international development assistance architecture, with a former head of DFID here. I'm sure it's very familiar territory for him. But what I found was the issue of, for me, international development aid for Nigeria was not very significant. But still, my attitude to it is that every additional dollar counts. So if aid support is being given, how do we get the best out of that? How do we organize in such a way? Initially, when I took over as Minister of National Planning, all the development agencies all over, and every one of them is in Nigeria, but they were going all over, sometimes crisscrossing, stepping on each other with no focus, and I had to bring them together because the ministry is supposed to coordinate all their activities. And that work is what I covered in that chapter. The fourth chapter I wrote is sometimes when we are either in academics or even we think that policy implementation is something that is smooth and easy. I mean, you do all the analysis and so on and then implement. In that chapter, I showed that it's not as straightforward as we think. There are always a lot of challenges, a lot of people who are trying to trip you, vested interests that are not interested in making sure that the policy works. And I gave quite a number of examples there. I think one of the laws that I gave was a situation where there was a changeover in leadership in Nigeria after the death of President Eradua and the succession by President Jonathan. The Constitution had not provided for that kind of situation. What happened if a president dies in situ? So it was a very tense situation in the country. In fact, if it had not been handled carefully, it could have led to a lot of social and political upheaval. But quite a number of people, particularly the National Assembly, rose, and the small effort that some of us that were in the cabinet made to douse the tension is part of what I documented in the book. The co-authors, about, as I said, 11 of them, I'll quickly just mention. Andrew Nevin is here, so he will explain. Yemi Kale handled data, the issue of data, one of the key solutions to the agency problem. The agency problem arises a lot of time because of lack of accountability and transparency. The more and better quality data that you have, the better it is to address the agency problem. Aliu Ahmed, he was an expert on M&E. I worked with him very closely to set up a performance measurement system for the public sector in Nigeria, which the peak of which was a performance contract that was signed between each minister and the president, whereby each minister had key performance indicators, measurable, that they were reporting on a quarterly basis at the cabinet meeting, but also immediately go and address the Nigerian public through the press to literally account for their performance. Dr. Laniran and Nuruddeen Usman, both of them are here also. They address the issue of the resource curse or resource extraction, the issues that arise from there. Both of them are here, and I'm sure during the Q&A they may come in. Sarah Alade is an expert, a former deputy governor in the central bank. She's somebody who is very knowledgeable of monetary policy and fiscal policy, and the usual clash that sometimes arises in implementing monetary policy and the challenges with fiscal policy coordination. Emma Sanusi II, who is not a stranger to the school here. When I actually wanted him to come here, but he had a clash with the time. Yes, he's been here a couple of times to make presentations. He addressed the issue of speaking out, especially by the elite. You know, when do you have these challenges of self-interest, lack of transparency, and so on? It's always good to have people who will speak out. And he covered the incidents that he had when he was governor of the central bank And he made revelations about the fact that petroleum revenues were not being properly accounted for. Because he could see the accounts, he could see the figures. And unfortunately, that got him in trouble with the president, who suspended him, partly because the petroleum minister was a very powerful minister at the time. So I think he documented that and addressed the importance of speaking out in order to bring about change. Benedict Orama is the immediate past president of the African Export-Import Bank. Now, he compared the agency problem in running a national Exim bank versus the challenges in running a global or continental Exim bank like the African Export Bank, because he started from the Nigerian Export-Import Bank. And in his position as in charge of the African Export Bank, he also had relationships with the various other African Exim banks. And so that's the aspect that he covered. Olufemi Taiwo went through the global North versus global South argument, which is one of the, again, theories of why some countries are developing and others are not so developing. Charlie Robertson is an investment, equity investment advisor, very active in the London scene. He also had a lot of experience of Nigeria and other African countries. And he wrote on the issue of the role of foreign investment. How do you manage that? Again, the interest of the foreign investors sometimes is completely different from the interest of the country that they are actually investing in. We've had that situation in Nigeria many times. As the economy is doing very well, you find especially the short-term investors trooping in. Nigerian bonds, for example, their value has been going like a yo, depending on the prospects, political issues, and so on in Nigeria. So those guys will come in when things are good, and as soon as they see the earliest sign, they are out. So how does a country manage that kind of cyclicality? The last chapter was written by Dr. Oyebode Oyetunde, Legal Frameworks for Fiscal Reform. I found he was actually a latecomer into the book, but when he made a presentation at an event that I attended, and I found the amount of work that they had done trying to document and give legal backing to reforms, I thought that is obviously a solution, one of the key solutions to the agency problem. Because sometimes what happens, the reason people either misbehave or whatever, is because there are no boundaries defined. There are no rules, there are no regulations, there are no consequences. So his chapter. Now, what conclusions did we arrive at? That institutional quality is endogenous to, institutional quality is endogenous to incentive design. Technical reforms must embed accountability mechanisms ex ante. The legislation, which I've just mentioned, legislate fiscal rules and data transparency, these are low-hanging fruits that need to be captured. And then elite consensus and citizen voices will help to, and Stefan obviously will agree, or maybe I'm agreeing with Stefan there because he actually emphasized the issue of elite consensus. in Nigeria, have we achieved elite consensus? Unfortunately, not yet. And that is, in fact, part of the problem. The elite, most of, unfortunately, they are all more interested in their own selfish interests than the national interest. And as demonstrated by Stefan, until and unless the elite actually get this consensus, development will become very difficult. Now, the overall conclusion I came to in the book is that, as you've seen, I was in the private sector for many years before I got into the public sector. And when we were in the private sector, we used to say, look, these politicians, if only we could get the economy right, everything would be all right, you know? Now, with my experience in policy making in the public sector, I came to the bitter conclusion that unless you get the politics right, nothing will be all right, you know? And it was a big wake-up call for me, in the sense that, especially economists, we sit down and build all these nice models, and we think that if we just apply all the econometric models that we have, we'll be able to solve the problems. I think it's quite enlightening for an economist to realize that, look, the politics trumps the economics, because unless you actually get the politics right, you would not. So coming to that conclusion, things were looking a bit bleak. Is there any hope? The problem is that the people who have the power to change the system, which are the politicians, who have to make new laws and so on, are the greatest beneficiaries of the dysfunction. So they have no incentive to change anything. You know, you need the system to change, even the political system itself to be reformed. But who are those to reform the political system? Who have the power to do it? Is the politicians. And they are the greatest beneficiaries of the system that is not working. And when you look at it, you almost lose hope. But I am an optimist, and I ended up by saying, for me, there is hope. Yes, in Nigeria particularly, and in a number of other developing countries, if you try reform as a huge gargantuan reform, like Indonesia has done, like Malaysia and so on, that Saudi Arabia is doing now in its 2030, the politics of some of our countries will not allow that kind of, because you focus everybody's attention on what you are trying to do. And so many people will try to sabotage what you're doing. But if it is sectoral reforms, and certain things are even happening in spite of people, you know, and I gave just a few examples. The telecom sector, for example. Nigeria, at one time when we had landlines, we had one of the worst telephone systems in the world. President Obasanjo just deregulated that sector, brought in the GSM phones. So Nigeria actually overtook the landlines. And today, the GSM system in Nigeria is probably one of the most efficient and effective. So we literally leapfrogged the landlines. So that is technology for you. The same in the financial sector. The fintech sector in Nigeria is one of the most active. Technology, especially digitalization, can be used to actually transform. When we were appointed in 1999 as governors of the central bank, everything function of the central bank was manual. One of the reforms we did was complete digitalization of that. And that completely transformed the bank and the financial system. Because here now, everything was real-time online. And that what helped me when I was Minister of Finance was because of my central banking background. I could sit in my office and see on my system, on my computer system, all the accounts of all the banks, all the accounts of all the government agencies in the banks. So transparency through digitalization is part of what can help. The constitutional legal reforms are happening, but very slowly. When the National Assembly tried to reform the Constitution as a whole, it becomes highly political. But as they are taking it bit by bit now, in line with any problems that are arising, change is happening more slowly than you would have wanted, but certainly it's happening and it's easier. The petroleum refineries and the public sector refineries have not worked in Nigeria for the last 30, 40 years. And you had this unfortunate situation where Nigeria is one of the largest producers of crude, but it's also the largest importer of refined products because all our government-owned refineries never worked. Yet a lot of money, billions of dollars have been spent over the years in trying to to get these refineries to work. Now, enter Dangote refinery. So again, some people are doing things in the private sector, and the Dangote refinery is a very good example of change, of earth-shattering change, not only for Nigeria, but for Africa. Dangote, with his courage, decided to build a 650,000 barrels per day refinery, the biggest single train refinery anywhere in the world. And a lot of people said he's not going to be able to. In Nigeria, you can't do that in Nigeria. But he has proven everybody wrong. The refinery is successful. Not only is he meeting all of the needs of Nigeria, but he's exporting refined aviation fuel now to the United States, to parts of Europe. A lot of refineries in Europe, the smaller ones, are at great risk from competition from the Dangote refinery in particular. So I end up, I think, on this note to say that things are tough, but I'm very optimistic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Usman, for that wonderful presentation, your wonderful book. We're now going to invite our distinguished panelists up and our moderator, Dr. Michael Odijie, for the panel. So everyone can please make your way to the front.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So before we get into questions, I have one. So in chapter 6 of the book, you mentioned some of the reforms that you did, but there is no discussion of sustainability. That's what are the effects of the reforms today? So you discussed reforms in the 2008, 2009. So my question would be, what are the effects of the reforms? You mentioned custom. So the custom currently, I don't know what's going on there, but the last time I dealt with Nigeria custom, it was in shambles. So my question is, what are the effects of your reforms? So just pause, think about that. I want Professor Nevin to to give us a 5-10 minutes introduction of your chapter, especially the issue of social contract. Yeah, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? I'm Canadian, so I'm very soft-focused. First off, let's give it up for the Honourable Minister. A big hand. And let me, great honour for me to know the Honourable Minister, to participate in the book. So let me start quickly. Agency problem. Sounds like something you shouldn't care about. You walk into Costa Coffee, you're going to pay $4.50 for a flat white. Someone else is making your coffee. You're the principal, they're the agent, right? They have to make the coffee on your behalf. Now that's a pretty simple transaction, but it gets more complicated. You go see the auto mechanic. You don't know much about auto mechanic. You don't know anything about the car. The guy tells you, sorry, it could be a woman now, which is great, $1,200. Are they acting on your behalf? Are they doing the right thing? Is there a repair for $800 that could work? Does it need to be repaired at all? Is the $1,200 going to fix it? You go to the doctor gives you advice on that. And of course, in the case of a doctor, we have all sorts of safeguards, the type of people we choose to become doctors, the kinds of training that they're given, the ethics that they have, the oversight that they have. But if you think about it, I mean, the reason you have the principal agent problem in the world is because no one can live a life in the modern world doing everything themselves. They have to rely on others on that. So the principal agent problem is not some arcane issue. It's everywhere for every one of us. Now when you take it to the government, you have to rely on the government to do things that are in your interest. And of course, no country is perfect. It's not easy on that. But as the Honourable Minister said, I spent 15 years living in Nigeria. It's the longest I've lived anywhere as an adult. The principal agent problem, as he said, he wrote the book about, is really at the heart of what the problem is. Now, Professor Dercon, our Harvard, Oxford, he's actually right. I learned the most important things at Oxford, not at Harvard. And I had the privilege here of studying politics and philosophy over at Balliol. And I was taught, because my first degree was in computer science and mathematics, so I'd never written an essay, I'd never read anything about any of these subjects, but I got to learn about the social contract. When I lived in Nigeria, I used to stand up 2014 through about till the COVID time and speak often about the economy. And I would say the following, I would say, everyone here thinks that the Nigerian government is actually quite powerful. And how many Nigerians are here, by the way? Okay, fantastic, fantastic to see you all. The government is quite large and powerful, but it turns out that given the population of Nigeria, the entire spending of the Nigerian at all three levels of government, so the national level, the state level, and the local level, was $200 per person, $200 US per person, 40,000 naira per person. And you can ask the question, well, I mean, the government's supposed to help with education, it's supposed to help with infrastructure, it's supposed to help with power, it's supposed to help with medical care, particularly primary medical care, with the legal system, with the customs system. I mean, how can you do that for $200 per person on that? And of course, the answer is you can't. And in those days in Nigeria, there was a very simple social contract. The government didn't ask you anything, and they didn't give you anything. So there was really no relationship between the government and the people. And you went to Abuja, and still today, but there were 1,000 MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies. And in a sense, you could think of this almost as a I hesitate to use the term, but a little bit of a Potemkin government. There was the structure of having a government, but the purpose of these 1,000 MDAs was not to actually provide any service. It was to provide patronage in the system that the Honourable Minister has so described. So you had this system. You didn't get anything and you didn't give it anything. Now, the reality is that social contract actually makes kind of logical sense, right? Like if you think about it, there's a certain logic to you don't get anything, you don't give anything on that. But as we went through the 2010s, it broke down. It broke down for a number of reasons. One is, even though it's certainly logical, it's not ideal for all the reasons that everyone in this institution understands. Secondly, the population is increasing rapidly and oil production is going down, so that the pool of money that's available to not ask for anything starts to decline. So the government started to ask for anything, started to ask for things. They started to ask for tax revenue on that. And that created a very wrenching situation because, you know, one of the reasons I love being in Nigeria, people said you love Nigeria and Nigerians. And I said, well, that's true. But the thing that was most amazing about being in Nigeria is witnessing history. So to witness this transformation, wrenching transformation from this social contract, you give nothing, you get nothing, to a social contract where you give something and you get something, was an incredible experience. And we've been undergoing this for the last decade on that. Like the Honourable Minister, I am a great optimist about Nigeria. I live now in Dallas, but I'm still very connected to it. I sit on a number of boards. I have a number of angel investments in the country, which are incredible people doing incredible things. But I'll just end by, one very specific thing that heartens me is the change of some of the key leaders making these decisions, and who really, I think, are the ones that are helping to solve the principal agent problem. And I'll cite four of them. I'll begin with the Honourable Minister, who's chairman of something called the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, which is the government federal body that basically oversees or manages all the assets of the federal government, apart from the NNPC. Massive job, very important. We wrote a paper when I was there, I think in 2016, about the fact that Nigeria was a rich country but had so many dead assets. And the Honourable Minister's job is to make those assets live, and we couldn't think of a better person to be in that position. I think of Taiwo Odeli, who was my brother when I was at PwC, who's taken over the tax. He's not the head of the FIRS, but head of the commission that's reforming the tax. Absolute brilliant young man, is making so many of the right changes for that, and absolute integrity. I'll cite the chairman of the NNPC and the new board there, which I think they've chosen very good people there. And finally, I'll cite the governor of the bank, Central Bank of Nigeria, who is just outstanding. So when I look at this change and this transformation from a country where you give nothing, get nothing, to a new social contract that works, and where you have the agents of government working on behalf of the principals of their citizens, when I look at those four positions, which I could argue were the four most important kind of non-elected positions in the economy, we now have outstanding people. So I'm very optimistic on the journey. I see fantastic things every day. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. So God bless Nigeria.
So before I invite Stefan to respond, but is it not possible to shift your analysis to the state level instead of federal? Because I'm thinking Lagos State. I'm not sure you can argue that there's no social contract in Lagos State before 2008. Because our current president, Tinubu, he was able to increase taxation, and there was some form of expectation from the people of Lagos State.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
the transformation, I came to Lagos the first time in 2008, so a lot of it had already started, but the transformation is being incredible there. And there is a legitimate social contract that's been developing over 20 years there. Of course, Yemi Cardoso was the finance minister for President Tinubu on that, so he's appeared in that as well. I used to talk a lot about state-led development in Nigeria. The sad thing is, I think, some states have good governors, often followed by bad governors. Some states have bad governors, followed by good governors. Unfortunately, we're not getting that continuity of kind of 8, 12, 16 years in enough states.
Okay. But my point is, if this is the case, that Lagos State has a different social contract, shouldn't we be discussing how to decentralize from the federal to the state level, as opposed to social contract at the federal level?
Well, I was a big proponent of decentralization when I was in Nigeria, so I absolutely agree with you.
Okay.
But as I said, unfortunately, I think the federal government's making progress. I think a lot of states have not made enough progress, as much as I would have liked to see in the last 5 or 10 years.
Thank you very much. So would you like to respond?
Yes, well, look, it's actually fascinating what you're talking about, and I admire the optimism that you bring here. And I definitely, we can't be in this business thinking about growth and development in countries like Nigeria, and if we're not optimists, we're not going to get anywhere. But I just want to make a few points and it's a few that I want to, and I observe there's quite a few of my students here, and I say, well, you come a week too early. Because next week, I'm actually going to lecture about principal agent problems and ways to overcome it. So any of my students here, there will be a lot more on this, and it's true. And it's, of course, it's fascinating. So here, and to be clear, the principals should be the citizens. They should be in charge. They should set the objective of a state. And then you have the agents, who you may or may not elect, but they need to do your stuff. And the principal agent problem, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics, whether it's the boss versus the employee, the professor versus their students, it's always there, that the agents, they can play with it and doing it. And it's this whole issue is that there is no alignment between the interests of the principal and on those who have to actually do it. Citizens have certain objectives. They want development, they want growth, they want something they want jobs. And then you have the agents having to do this. So, and why I want to build this up is actually quite an interesting thing, because I do think there's actually quite a lot of alignment in the way we think about it. But I want to come around to it a little bit on another end. Okay, so problem is clearly that principals have very different interests than the agents, and citizens want certain things, and the people who actually we entrust to do things, and not least in places like Nigeria, but of course everywhere to some extent, they hold all the power. The agent holds the power, and that's actually this kind of strange thing. You know, the citizens should hold all the power, but actually it's the agent. We're so dependent on it, and we can't get them to act in our interest. And I liked, and I'll definitely read also a bit more in detail what former governor and Emir Sanusi II talks about, is that there's a lot of people that allow these agents to act. And that's where I would want to come, is this kind of the elite deal around it. You know, it's not just the few politicians behind them. You know, politics costs money. There's a lot of people who pay for that to actually have it. Civil servants are often in cahoots in it, you know, because they like the status quo as well. They don't really want to do anything. I work, as I told my students today, I work a lot these days in Pakistan, and similarly, civil servants make a habit of not trying to do anything. You know, that's an objective. That's their objective. Let's try not to do anything and do it. And I must say, you know, I had former students in the MPP here when I visited them back in Nigeria and asked them to do it. Oh, I run my own startup. And I said, but I thought you're a civil servant. No, I just do it from my office, which is not uncommon, I'm afraid, of doing that. So anyway, there's a lot of people allow that to happen, but it's not in the interest of most people. So there's some people that let it happen, and that's a bit like, and so my thing is always a bit like, if we want to make progress, we need to understand more in a granular detail, and you're beginning to do this towards the end, and that's why I will read it. Now, what are these interests that actually keep that status quo, that don't do anything? And what is the joint interest? I remember going to Lagos and talking to the business community, and you know, the person, and let's not name it, who had brought me over there, a well-respected person, he basically said, you know, and just tell them it's them as well. The finance sector in Lagos, you allow them to do it because you're the recycler of all the kind of wealth that Nigeria creates and not necessarily distributes further, and you do it. So understand their objectives. And so, and I think one of the problems with Nigeria is, despite the fact that lots of people, including former students from here, you know, Zainab Usman is still saying, look, we passed the oil phase, you know, but the oil is still hanging there. Because that's the free rent. That's the kind of $100, $200 per year for the government, depending on the prices, that you don't have to do a day's work for, you know. Now, if I just say 100 and 200, yeah, that's if you were to divide it amongst all citizens in the country, like you were doing. But that's not how you want to think about it, because if you had to divide it amongst 200 million people, it's only $100 or $200. But if you can divide it amongst, rather than 200 million people, 200,000 people, I get all of us 100 or 200,000 plus probably a house in London. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that you're actually sitting up. There is something there that the status quo is so attractive for a lot of the people, as you were ending. And that's a bit like the objective function is there, it's not different. It's in lots of places not the same as the citizens, but there is something, a free resource to keep that status quo as well. And we just can't get our heads around of how to handle that better. Because that's actually the thing. You know, if you have a principal-agent problem where objectives are clearly misaligned, you know, why do I talk about, and you also come to it, talk about elite consensus or at least coalitions? Actually, what you're saying, can we actually realign objectives? Because there's no principal-agent problem, as you know well, if the objectives are not misaligned. And actually, I look at countries that begin to make progress, where we get a class that actually has the power, whose objectives are not misaligned with the citizens. And that becomes then the design issue. How do you get, rather than just an incentive-compatible design, which I appreciate, to actually say, well, you don't have to get very complicated incentives if your objective functions are close. And I think a lot of countries progressed when there was a way of between elites and the people that they needed to serve, that they found ways of realigning incentives aligning objectives rather than trying to do it from incentives. But of course, the same thing, you know, I don't mind. If we can do it with a hammer, with accountability, with transparency of your things, or you can do it because they actually realign their objectives so that they don't have that difference, I don't mind too much. And that is really interesting also, the things at the end, you know. How do we get reform in a country like Nigeria? Well, you know, we need to think a bit about, you know, where is it in those people with power? And I'm thinking often even, not just necessarily the civil servants or political class, but also the business community. Why are they quiet, as Emir Sanusi is saying? Why are they quiet, you know? Can we not get them to actually say, look, it's in our interest that this pie is growing, that the economy is growing, and that it's not just a relatively small economy still, but actually that it can grow. And can we get other forces to create more pressure so that actually we're getting a different class of people that actually holds the power, that actually can be the agents in that respect. So it's different ways. And I love the example of the Dangote thing as well, to think, because, you know, I can also read the newspapers and the unions and whoever gets mobilized to try to block it. You know, there's lots of forces that are being used to even undermine him to try to do the thing. So anyway, so it's a great thing. Where we are is actually thinking, you know, where are the entry points? Who can actually begin to change? Can we divide the forces of the status quo so that actually is a more alignment with some sensible things? And I really think actually business community could play a massive role in Nigeria. But I fear, in my mind, too many of them, it suits, the status quo suits them as well. And I think that's probably where. I love the optimism about the team of the president at the moment. I feel myself, to be honest, a little bit disappointed. I wish they had done more. There's a few people. The Lagos example was a massive thing. I just wish they could be a little bit more coherent in their strategy. They're lacking a bit of a strategy because, yeah, they are the people maybe that can begin to do the reforms, that can break somehow this coalition of the status quo and begin to make progress. But anyway, I want to congratulate on a fascinating book and an insights. And I won't say that much more today. Thank you.
Dr. Usman, do you want to respond to all of that before we open the question?
Okay, I think before that, let me respond to Stefan's point about why is the business community not shouting? The reason is, I think, for the same example, when I said those who can change the system have a vested interest in not changing it. Yeah. It includes the business community. Yeah. It's not just the politicians. Yes. Many of the businesses are highly dependent on government. There are very few of them. Take Dangote, for example. At an earlier stage, he was also dependent on a lot of subsidies from government. Now he's become so big and so almost, you know, you've seen how people try to sabotage the refinery. And he has enough clout now to be able to prevent that from happening. So I think for the same reason, the business community, many of them don't want to take on government because, and sometimes the consequences, you can be actually identified and the politicians will come after you and make sure that your business is crushed or whatever. So a high risk of not doing so.
Do you allow me 30 seconds to actually add to something? Because I think I totally agree. And we see this in quite a lot of other countries. And sometimes I get young Nigerians that you bump in and all entrepreneurial and what should I do? And I always, and I wonder what you say to that, is that I always tell them, you know, the one thing that probably begins to break this all looking all the way at Abuja, at the government and what they should be doing, is you begin to sell to the world. And actively seeing, because if you begin to sell to the world, you need another type of government for you. One that actually is willing to say, look, I want to compete with the world rather than I want to import, substitute and do my little accounting stuff and so on. And because it becomes then, we've seen this definitely in Asia, that the politics of the economy changed a lot. Once they became dependent on exports and because they were an export orientation and so on and so on. I just wonder, you sitting there, whether I'm being naive here.
No, I think you're right there because take, again, the Dangote is a good example. is exporting now to the United States, to Europe, to other parts of Africa. So, you know, selling to the world, literally. The Nigerian banking system is also doing that in the sense that many Nigerian banks are all over, particularly West Africa, Southern Africa, and even some in the UK, in the US. So that diversification is making some of them obviously much more, not so much focused on Abuja or Lagos, and much more in terms of international business. Okay. Now, the question you asked about, first of all, the success of some of the reforms that I tried to do. I think I gave a fairly good assessment, my own assessment of how successful I have been. And unfortunately, it's not very successful for a number of reasons that I've explained. How much of some of those reforms remain? The 30-year infrastructure master plan is still there. The two subsequent governments that have come have adopted it, and they're obviously modifying it, you know, with time and the circumstances. So that's there. The M&E and performance management system is there, particularly, but the distance I took it in terms of getting ministers to be responsible, to have key performance indicators that are being measured and reported on. The system is there, but unfortunately, you know, the emphasis on getting it done on a regular basis is not there. And what are the reasons? Again, lack of continuity, which is a point I made very strongly about the book. Almost every president comes, and sometimes they look at, they don't even study what has been done. They just sweep out everything that has been done. And this is not something that is peculiar to Nigeria or developing countries. It happens even, I mean, look at what is happening in the United States, or even here in Britain, you know? So you have a change in government, and then they come and sweep out every positive thing. They don't even try to understand, because especially if you are new in government, it will take you at least 6 months to understand what your predecessor has been doing. They don't spend that time, they don't spend the energy. And it's the same at minister level. A new minister comes in. When I handed over to the minister that took over from me in national planning in an acting capacity, this performance thing, I used to take on ministers at cabinet level. In fact, everybody was, they used to refer to me as the headmaster, you know, because as soon as every minister finishes his presentation, the first person that the president will ask to comment, you say, Shamsuddin, what is your comment? You know? Now, and I used to be very frank. You know, if you've not done it properly, I will say it there in the cabinet meeting. The person who took after me, when I saw him, I asked him, why are you not carrying on with this? He said, I don't want to offend my ministerial colleagues. Now, if that's your attitude to work, then clearly you are not likely to be successful. But also, I think what contributes to this lack of continuity also is lack of accountability and lack of consequences, you know, for non-performance. That is very, very critical. To give you just one simple example, because we have serious challenge with power in Nigeria, the performance metrics, the KPIs we developed for, together with the Minister of Power at the time, because they were the ones who developed their own KPIs. I just supervised. One of the things we put in their performance, in the Minister of Power as an example, is we used to have this series, and they are still happening, where the whole grid of the country collapses because of the poor electricity system. So one of the things we put is that the minister will solve that problem of collapsing of grid over a period of 1.5 years. And if he failed to do so, he will have to resign or the president will sack him. So lack of these kinds of consequences for non-performance, I think is what sort of leads to lack of success with many of the reform measures.
Thank you very much. So now open up for questions. Okay, please.
They'll bring it back.
Awesome. Thanks for the discussion.
Please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Perfect. My name is Jeremy Simpson. I'm doing the MSc in Economics for Development. I have a general question for the panel just about this idea of the principal agent problem. And I think it's quite interesting, especially when you start thinking about state-owned enterprises, which are a frequent sort of occurrence in Africa and in a lot of developing countries. And I think about the sort of example of South Africa and a lot of the issues that we've had with electricity and power generation over the last couple of years. How do you think we can create institutions that can help sort of almost discipline these state-owned enterprises that are really supposed to be owned by the government, but have another sort of step between the principles that they should be acting on behalf? Yeah, thank you.
One more.
No, there was one more.
Okay.
Let's take a few.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ebuka. I'm a Nigerian, so that's why I'm here. My question really is it's an interesting development, very good topic we're talking about. But my question is around intergenerational equity. So when you have a situation whereby the population, who are the principal in this case, are unable to agree, or I don't even know what their objective function is because of several factors. It could be poor education, it could be lack of awareness, or it could even be disinterest. So in that case, you've talked about the elite consensus, but it's difficult to have a clear objective function for the principal. So, and my question again is around, I would like to use an example on digitalization, which Dr. Shamsuddeen talked about. So, using a clear example of the central bank digital currency, which I know Dr. Andrew Nevin worked on, for example, there's no continuity there. It was passed off as a perfect example of something that will solve a lot of problems, solve the exchange rate problems at that time, but we are not hearing about it. Nigeria was the first to introduce a central bank digital currency, but it's just like a full stop. So back to the question, intergenerational equity, a population that does not necessarily know what they want or is unable to agree on a consensus. How do we solve that problem? Thank you.
Okay. I think we should take that first.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe you go first.
Well, let me take a crack at that. Let me start. I'll keep it. We'll come back to the issue about state-owned enterprises. But yeah, I mean, I was a huge advocate. I was publicly out in front of the CBDC. I in the media all the time. I worked on the project for the central bank government, the Central Bank of Nigeria. So it was a great tragedy to me. And it was a policy that was really pro bottom of the pyramid, right? Because if you had a central bank currency, you now had a way to do transactions at zero cost. The other thing it would have driven, which is really interesting, was that once you have a wallet that you can hold the digital currency in, people realize you can tokenize interest-earning assets, and people won't hold the currency, they'll move to an interest-earning asset. So you can, even if you only have 50,000 naira or 5,000 naira, you can hold an asset that now earns you 15% instead of being 0% in the bank. So it was really something that was a great, very painful to me to see it unwind. But I don't think this problem is particularly unique to Nigeria. As the Honorable Minister said, every country kind of stops and starts. I mean, I live in the United States at the moment. The damage that's been done to the health research infrastructure is, if it's fixed by the next administration, still 10, 20 years of damage on that. So I'm not sure what the solution is. But on the state-owned enterprises, first, you have the person that oversees the majority of all of the state-owned enterprises apart from, at the federal level, apart from the NNPC right here in the room. And he is doing the right thing. We've got the right agent for for the principles on that. But in many cases in Nigeria, these state-owned enterprises should not be state-owned enterprises. So before you get to the issue of having a state-owned enterprise that's effectively run, I mean, power, for example, I mean, with the advent of renewables and the way solar power economics work, it's highly distributed. You don't need the centralized thing. So these state-owned enterprises were, again, set up not to serve the principals. They were set up to serve the agents. It was another form of conduit for losses. We had the refineries that soaked up billions of dollars without producing a single drop or a single barrel of crude, of sort of refined product on that, just to siphon off money, right? So in a lot of cases, those enterprises actually need to be privatized. And I say that as someone who's quite left on the political spectrum. So that's not my natural thing to privatize this. But in many cases in Nigeria, and I'm sure I won't speak for him, but the Honourable Minister, for many of the assets that he oversees, is looking at privatizing because they shouldn't be held in the public space. Because the reason for being held by the public enterprise wasn't to help the public; it was to enrich the people that were involved up and down the chain.
The first person who asked the first question, sorry, I didn't quite catch your name. Jeremy. Maybe when you finish your degree, get in touch with me. I may have a job for you. But seriously, that's the task that I have now. I am the chairman of the board of what is called Ministry of Finance Incorporated. And our responsibility is to manage all of the assets of the federal government and all of its investments. Let me correct you, Andrew. We own 50% of NMPs.
Oh, that's even better then.
So even the oil company, we own 50% of that. And in fact, there is a proposal to convert it to 100%. So that, and the task that we have is really, I think, what you've addressed. The first thing we had to do when we were first appointed 2 years ago or 3 years ago was, first of all, to say, do we even know all these assets? You know, so the first thing we put in motion is to do a complete assets register for all the assets of the government, corporate assets, physical assets, you know. That process is continuing. It's going to take years. There's really no time that you're going to be able to complete it. But we made a lot of progress with that. Then we are looking at some of the specific institutions, starting with the key ones, you know, the NMPC, the oil company, a government-owned oil company. And basically what we are doing is what is called corporatization, you know, to try and change their, or get systems around them. Good corporate governance, proper boards, strong strategic plans, and really ensuring that, you know, and the focus is not on selling. In the process, we may have to sell some of them. Because I think I was also in my earlier life in charge, you know, the COO of the organization that started privatization in Nigeria. So at that time, the focus was on selling, get rid of all these government investments. The focus now is on turnaround. You know, we realize that you don't have to sell. You can increase the value and performance of many of these organizations by simply the kind of reform that we are doing on each and every one of them.
Yeah. So what kind of reform are you doing on Ajaokuta steam mill?
Ajaokuta for me, and I've said this publicly, if I had a buyer for Ajaokuta for $1, if I am sure has the capacity to turn it around and make it produce. For those of you that don't know Ajaokuta, is a steel plant that was started some
1976, I think.
some
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago.
50 years ago.
Over 16 billion, 14, 16 billion.
Well,
That's the figures.
no. I think the estimate is between $8 to $10 billion
Yeah.
have been spent on this steel plant, but up to today it has not produced a ton of steel. Again, partly, now the international dimension also comes in. Unfortunately, at that time, the Cold War between the US and Russia was, very hot. We took Russians as our partner. So it's Russian technology and so on. And I'm sure that is even part of the reason, the sabotage. But it's so really, for me, as I said today, and unfortunately, it's one of what we call the PCs, portfolio companies, under this MOFI that I'm chairing. In fact, just last month, we brought the management of the company to come and give us if they had any plan of how to solve the problem. And clearly, they don't. So for me, if you can find anybody that can manage such a huge steel company, and it's there, it's about 95% completed. That's the tragedy.
Yeah.
It's 95% completed. But when you go, and I have been there a number of times, and drive through, it's literally a whole town. But it's like a graveyard. These huge steel mills are there, but not producing anything. So I said, even now in my position as chairman, if you can find me somebody who knows how to run a steel plant and is willing to do so, I would sell it to him for $1. Because the benefits of getting it to function for the country are going to be huge. It's going to be as transformative as the Dangote refinery.
I agree with that, yeah. Okay, more questions. Let's take some.
So the whole room is full of hands.
Yeah, let's take some from here.
There are two ladies here that have been raising their hands.
Okay, we'll come to that.
Thank you very much, sirs. My name is Temitope, and my question is quite very simple and a bit theoretical in nature. I want to explore the fundamentals of social contract that you've spoken about, and the background of which we are coming from is from elections. We can argue for social contracts if there's no voter party, where there's a strong participation in elections. If we look at the last election in Nigeria in 2023, we had roughly under 30% of eligible voters voting. How do we argue, or how do we reconcile the facts where the fundamentals of social contracts are not significant? That's the first question. The second thing is that try to be much more optimistic like you guys. How dependent is the development of social contracts in national development? Thank you.
Maybe one more from here. Okay, yeah.
Hello, good evening. My name is Ayola Fadaunsi. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about, you mentioned Dangote's oil refinery as like a major breakthrough. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. And then you also mentioned about wanting more privatization, but we've seen in the past that like even private companies are not benefiting the public and people are just making more money. And you mentioned that private agents are also part of like the agents in this dichotomy that we have here. So I'm just curious how Dangote's oil refinery and also increased privatization might actually benefit Nigerian citizens. So I just wanted to get more of an understanding on that. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe
Good evening. My name is Idanesi Emmanuel. I'm not a student here. I saw this online and I thought I'd come along. Very interesting conversation. And my question follows on from Jeremy's question and the last thing that the Honorable Minister touched upon, which is continuity. So you've talked about looking at the state-owned assets and trying to turn them around. You also, interestingly, started the privatization all those years ago. What do you think would be the best way to ensure that whatever is put in place now, there is some form of continuity, even as other people come on the scene and take over? Also, and now this is talking about the assets which are state-owned and will remain state-owned. And for those assets which will probably be sold off, what do you see is the infrastructure in place that would ensure that for those businesses or those assets, there is accountability to make sure that it produces it? First of all, they run it properly. Secondly, there is how do I put this delicately? There is a mechanism in place to ensure, as you said, the consequence if you don't get it right. So, for example, there is...
Just one sentence.
Oh, forgive me. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, then. So we can take...
I think we need to...
Maybe we should answer this first.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Do you want to go first?
Well, the issue on the Dangote refinery, so I mean, there was a system before the Dangote refinery where we're the largest importer of refined products in the world, as the Honourable Minister said, but it was essentially a source of corruption, right? I mean, it was a source of corruption because the people that were awarded the licenses, that system was corrupt. It was a source of corruption because if you could produce the paper, because it was in a system of fuel subsidy or foil subsidy, right? So if you could either participate physically or actually participate like just producing the documents, the government would send you a check. And prior to the last, the president being elected in 2023, that spending was basically as large as all the other spending of the government together. So by removing the foil subsidy, and then the Dangote refinery, there's no reason to import refined products because the Dangote makes more refined product than the entire nation needs. And so the entire supply chain is restructured. And people that were rent-seeking in this system, I mean, I personally knew people whose jobs were seeking rent, and they were oil importers, but that was basically a code word for, I will say, a criminal, or a rent-seeking criminal. So the Dangote refinery, God bless him, has eliminated that entirely on that. So I think it has a huge positive impact. What I'll say about the privatization of the companies, I mean, the Honourable Minister is in charge of MAFI. Their group is going to decide which companies should be privatized, which should be turned around, which should be closed. I mean, that's the work of and of course, it depends on the nature of the industry. There's a public service reason for an industry remaining in public hands. MAFI is going to figure that out. It's going to remain in private hands. In the case of NNPC, I don't know what the Honourable Minister is going to decide. I've always been of the view that it should be partially privatized. So remain in public hands. I always thought a majority, some people think a minority, but listed on the stock exchange to create liquidity on the NSE, et cetera, and kind of a place for people to invest, particularly the pension funds on that. So I think it's really a case-by-case basis. But, I mean, the Honourable Minister is going to take the precautions to make sure for the assets that remain in the public sector, there's going to be the governance standards that keep them doing what they should is their role as the agent on behalf of the principals. And I assume he's going to fire the people that aren't acting in the best interest of the principals. And then we owe an answer to the gentleman with the social contract, but I'll leave that to you.
Yes. Let me address the question about the benefit of the Dangote refinery to the ordinary Nigerian. I think it's a very important question. First of all, as Andrew has answered, that especially the fraud around the subsidy scheme has been eliminated. And that was a huge amount, one of the most significant expenditures for the government at the time. Yeah. So obviously there's more revenue now that has been freed up. Is it going to be used for the benefit of the citizen? That's a second level question. But at least there is that. Yeah. But the ordinary citizen used to spend hours on queues trying to buy petrol. You know, remember when we had the petroleum shortages, there are times when your car can be on the queue for 2 days. People losing sleep, late to work, and so on. Those queues have disappeared. There's none of them anymore because fuel is available all over. And since Dangote started, he has actually been reducing the price of petroleum products. And the linkage also, some of the other refined petroleum that are going to be inputs into industrial production, polypropylene and some of the other things that, again, so these are all things that were being imported into Nigeria. So it's saving the country revenue, it's saving the country huge amounts of foreign exchange. So actually now, again, Temitope is here, he's working for the central bank. Our balance of trade and balance of payments are showing positive. Our reserves, the central bank has just actually reported level of reserves that we have not had, foreign reserves, for the last 12 years or more. Now, the biggest contributory factor to that is the Dangote refinery already, you know. So there are huge benefits to Nigeria and to Nigerians arising from that. Your question about continuity, again, from my experience in the public sector, writing this book, for me, I think a very important one is rooting policy in legislation. That's why, for example, this agency I'm heading, MOFI, Ministry of Finance and Corporate, is a very old one. It's been there since before the country's independence. It was set up in 1958, but it has just been a department in the Accountant General's office. All previous ministers of finance, including myself, are guilty because we didn't pay enough attention. Most of the investments of the federal government are in the name of this company, but the civil servants cornered it in the Accountant General's office. And all they were interested in, the government has shares in this company, who is going to be on the board. So they nominated themselves to be on the board. And as finance minister, you are too busy. I was battling with the National Assembly and everybody that I didn't pay enough attention to it. In fairness, the last minister, Zainab, is the one who actually paid attention and restructured this and turned it into a proper, with a board and everything, which is, and appointed us to be able to handle it. So for me, if you can ground reform in legislation, at least the possibility of somebody coming and immediately just throwing things around away will be reduced. It's not that it will not happen. If you have, unfortunately, somebody, the kind of pliant, is this being recorded? I have to be careful. I have to be careful since I'm still answerable to. But one of the things that we are doing now, for example, is struggling. The first thing we did also is to say, okay, let's anchor this reform in legislation. So we have a bill that is going through the National Assembly, and we hope that in the next few months is going to be approved, because that is what will give us more power to actually do some of the difficult reforms that are necessary.
Okay.
No, just
yes.
No, just a minimal amount of just a reflection on all this. So I'm hugely appreciative of the comments you make and the commitment you make. It's quite interesting from the question. They'll be watching you, and it's going to be quite an interesting thing, because in the end, change comes when there is behavior change, and when the agent, and you are also an agent in this whole system.
Yeah.
if they begin to change. So it is actually, my experience in other countries is it's usually not necessarily one big reform, but it's a sum of multiple agents beginning to act slightly differently that begins to make the change. So I'm pretty sure people will be watching you, but at the same time, I admire and respect hugely your commitment to do it well.
Okay. Sorry, we owe this gentleman
Sure.
about social contract.
Oh, social contract.
Yes. Quick. This gentleman, his question.
You
was-
are the expert on social.
Yeah.
Well,
So go ahead.
you know, I mean, I think this evolves. So I'm going to make a plug, answer your question the way I want to answer, which is what I always did on television. So I'm going to make, you know, people say, why are you optimistic about Nigeria? I mean, one reason I'm optimistic is because there are incredible people that step up to make change happen who are not asked to. One of them is Ayi Makwede, who's a partner of yours, and not of just of Blavatnik, but of yours personally. I know, Stefan, you'd be down there. Who basically built Nigeria's largest bank and financial institution. Now stepping up, he wants to change the government in a very positive way. But the one I was going to highlight is what I think is the most incredible organization I've ever seen, which is Madame Obi's SPPG. So when she lost the presidential election in 2019 as a third-party candidate, she said, what could I do? She realized one person winning would not make a difference. So she said, what could I create as a movement that will change politics forever? She set up a school that has about 250 people per class from every state in Nigeria that teaches them politics, economics, governance, ethics, etc. All the faculty members, including myself, are voluntary. We're now in our sixth class, I think, and it's starting to have a big impact. She's training people to change the political system. When you start to have 1,000 of them, 10,000 of them in a few years, it will really change. So that's going to change the social contract. So I'll give her a big shout out. But when I see people like I see people like Madame Obi who are prepared to do these things at a really big scale. It really makes me optimistic on Nigeria. But let me pause there. I don't want to really
All right.
And I think, sorry, just a short comment to confirm what Stefan said. And that was my conclusion, you know, to say that big, grandiose transformations will not work because there will be too much political and other interference. But a lot of these smaller changes are taking place quietly, you know, sometimes inevitably, with digitalization, for example, you know. So that's what gives me confidence and hope that it is this, you know, the different groups of change that are happening will get enough momentum at some time to really become the dominant factor in terms of transformation.
Okay.
Well, excellent. I think that's a really fitting and profound note to end on. So before I close us out, can we just hear a round of applause for our incredible panelists this evening? Michael, can I see your copy of the book just so I can hold it up to show everyone?
All right.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to remind everyone that the reason we're all here tonight is for this really wonderful tome, if I might, produced by Dr. Usman and his associates. And, you know, rather than thank them for being here, I want to congratulate Dr. Usman. I want to congratulate Dr. Nevin, Temitope Laniran, and Nuruddeen Usman, also contributors to the book, for what is really a milestone, I would say, in public policy analysis and in Nigerian academia more broadly. I strongly recommend that everyone who is interested in what was said tonight go and find a copy of this book. It's widely available. And one thing you'll notice, and it's not something we had time to touch on tonight because we were discussing the content, is, you know, if you flip through the table of contents and you see who actually contributed to this book and the roles that they've had in different sectors and facets of Nigerian political life, I think you'll be truly amazed by the diplomatic efforts that it must have taken to pull this all together. So allow me just to congratulate the authors for that one more time, and Michael for a wonderful moderation. And so before I close us all out, I want to say a special thank you to the Blavatnik School of Government, to Mr. Pascal Mensa and Mr. Nda Masuku, who did incredible amount of work to bring this all together. And so we thank them deeply for handling all of the organization. So thank you, guys. Please. All right, and with that, on behalf of the Oxford African Governance Forum, one more immense thank you to you all for being here, to our panelists, and I pronounce this session dismissed. Thank you.
Please, can we show the